The village of St. Mary Mead had seen many fine September afternoons, but the one that opened the autumn flower and produce show promised to be the finest in years. Sunshine poured like warm honey over the village green, glinting on the brass band's instruments and turning the rows of dahlias into jewels. Bunting fluttered between the chestnut trees, and the scent of Victoria sponge and freshly cut grass hung heavy in the air. In the marquee reserved for the photographic exhibition, a new and rather daring edition insisted upon by the younger element of the Women's Institute, Mrs. Bantry was already flushed with triumph. Her husband, Colonel Bantry, stood beside her in blazer and regimental tie, looking as though he would much rather be watching cricket. A dozen framed photographs lined the trestle tables, each carefully labeled in violet ink. At the very center, mounted on a small velvet easel, hung the prize of the morning, a large sepia portrait entitled Gossington Hall, 1912, A Family at Home. It showed Colonel Bantry's aunt, the late Mrs. Arthur Bantry, seated on the terrace steps with her 3 grown children ranged behind her. The eldest son, Lawrence, stood proud in his new subaltern's uniform. The daughter, Clarissa, smiled with the serene confidence of a girl who knows she's beautiful. And little Philip, barely 16, leaned affectionately against his mother's shoulder, a perfect Edwardian idyll. "Such a charming photograph," declared Miss Hartnell, peering through her lorgnette. "One quite feels one knows the family." Mrs. Price Ridley gave a little sniff. Clarissa Bantry was always vain. Look at that tilt of the chin, and poor Philip, such a tragedy what happened later. She was silenced by a sharp glance from Mrs. Bantry, who had no intention of having her husband's family dissected in public. At that moment, the brass band struck up Land of Hope and Glory, and the vicar mounted the little platform to declare the show open. Applause rippled politely. People began drifting from tent to tent, admiring giant leeks and prize roses. Miss Jane Marple, small and fluffy and dressed in pale grey lace, had been sitting quietly on a deck chair near the photographic marquee for the last 20 minutes. She appeared to be asleep behind her spectacles, but in fact she was watching everything with the mild, relentless attention of a cat at a mouse hole. She had noticed, for instance, that young Dr. Haydock's hands were not quite steady when he greeted Mrs. Lestrange, the mysterious newcomer who had taken the little house at the end of the lane 6 months ago and about whom nobody knew anything at all. She had noticed that Leonard Clement, the vicar's nephew, kept glancing at the sepia portrait with an expression that might have been anger or sorrow, or both. And she had noticed that when Mrs. Dane Calthrop, the vicar's wife, paused in front of the same photograph, her lips moved as though in silent prayer. None of these things, taken singly, amounted to very much. Human nature, as Miss Marple frequently remarked, was very much the same anywhere if one only took the trouble to observe it. At 3:30, the brass band paused for tea. The crowd thinned. Miss Marple rose, gathered her numerous small parcels, and made her slow way towards the photographic tent. She wanted another look at the portrait of the Bantry family. She was still 3 yards away when Mrs. Bantry's voice rang out, shrill with shock. "Arthur, Arthur, come quickly! Something dreadful has happened!" Colonel Bantry hurried in, several people at his heels. Miss Marple, unnoticed as usual, slipped quietly to the front. The velvet easel lay on its side. The glass was shattered. And across the lovely, smiling face of Clarissa Bantry, someone had slashed 3 deep, deliberate cuts with what must have been a very sharp knife. The sepia features were ruined beyond repair. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then the murmurs began. Who would do such a wicked thing? Some boyish prank, surely. Boys don't carry knives sharp enough for that. Inspector Craddock arrived within the hour, summoned, rather unnecessarily, by a telephone call from the colonel himself. He was a tall, calm young man who had learned a great deal from a previous encounter with Miss Marple and was perfectly prepared to learn more. He examined the damaged photograph. the splintered frame, the scraps of glass. He took fingerprints, though everyone had handled the easel at some point. He asked questions. Had anyone seen anything suspicious? Had anyone noticed a stranger loitering? No one had. By 5 o'clock, the show was breaking up in an atmosphere of hushed excitement. People spoke in low voices, casting furtive glances over their shoulders. The portrait had been removed to the police station in a cardboard box. The band packed away its instruments. The prize leaks were carried off in triumph. Miss Marple walked home along the lane, her mind busy. Vandalism, of course, was what everyone was calling it. A senseless act, probably by some delinquent from the council estate on the other side of Much Benham. Yet the cuts had been so very deliberate, so very personal. 3 slashes across Clarissa Bantry's face. And Clarissa, poor girl, had been dead these 40 years. At her gate, Miss Marple paused. Old Miss Hartnell was hurrying past, cheeks pink with indignation. Really, Jane, one feels quite unsafe. First Mrs. Lestrange arriving out of nowhere, and now this. Mark my words, there's more to it than meets the eye. Miss Marple smiled gently. My dear, there almost always is. That evening, after a light supper of poached egg on toast, she sat by the fire with her knitting. The clicks of the needles were steady and methodical. In the quiet room, the only other sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. 3 slashes across a face that had smiled out from a photograph taken in 1912. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes gleamed for a moment behind her spectacles. Dear me, she murmured to the empty room. How very interesting. Outside, the peaceful September dusk deepened over St. Mary Mead, and somewhere in the village, a murderer, for Miss Marple had no doubt that this was murder in intent, if not in fact, began to believe that a moment's vicious impulse had gone unnoticed. They were very much mistaken. By the following morning, the entire village knew every detail, and a dozen imaginary ones besides. The slashing of the photograph had become the outrage at the flower show, and the outrage had grown in the telling until it sounded almost as shocking as murder itself. At 10 o'clock, Mrs. Bantry rang up Miss Marple in a state of fluttering indignation. Jane, my dear, you simply must come to lunch. Arthur is being perfectly impossible. He says it is only some hooligan, but I know better. That photograph was priceless. My husband's own aunt, and Clarissa's face. Well, it is too dreadful. One feels quite ill. Miss Marple accepted with her usual gentle composure. She arrived at Gossington Hall just as the grandfather clock in the hall struck 1, carrying a small bunch of Michaelmas daisies from her own garden. Lunch was served in the morning room. Cold chicken, tomato salad, and a great many anxious glances from Mrs. Bantry towards the door. Colonel Bantry himself seemed determined to treat the whole affair as a minor annoyance. Dashed silly business, he kept saying, carving the chicken with unnecessary violence. Boys will be boys, or perhaps one of those beatnik types from the new estate. Police will catch him soon enough. Mrs. Bantry gave a little scream. Arthur, how can you? It was deliberate malice. Somebody hated Clarissa, hated her enough to destroy her face even after all these years. The colonel looked uncomfortable and reached for the mustard. Miss Marple ate her chicken in silence, her eyes mild and thoughtful. She noticed that the maid who waited at table, a new girl named Gladys, was unusually pale and kept glancing at Mrs. Bantry as though expecting a scolding. After lunch, Mrs. Bantry bore her friend off to the drawing room. Now, Jane, you must tell me what you think. You always understand these things. Who could possibly have done it? Miss Marple settled herself on the sofa and arranged her daisies in a vase. My dear Dolly, it is much too soon to say, but one thing is certain. The person who slashed that photograph knew exactly whose face they were attacking. It was not random mischief. Someone still nurses a grudge against poor Clarissa Bantry after 40 years. That is very interesting, is it not? Mrs. Bantry's eyes grew round. A grudge? But Clarissa died in 1921. Spanish influenza, everyone said. She was only 26. There was some talk at the time. You remember how people talk. Something about a young man, but nothing definite. Miss Marple nodded. People always talk, and sometimes they are right. Tell me, Dolly, who in the village today might have known Clarissa well enough to hate her still? Mrs. Bantry began counting on her fingers with increasing excitement. Well, there's old Miss Hartnell. She was at school with Clarissa. And Mrs. Price Ridley. Her mother was a great friend of Clarissa's mother. Then there's Mrs. Lestrange, though of course she's a stranger. Oh, and Leonard Clement, the vicar's nephew. His mother was Clarissa's cousin, I believe. He was only a baby when she died, but families remember these things. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. And Dr. Haydock, was he not the Bantry's doctor in those days? Old Dr. Haydock's son? Yes, he was quite a young man then. There was some story, but really, Jane, I can't remember. At that moment, the door opened and Colonel Bantry put his head in. Post's come, old girl. Letter for you, London postmark. Looks like Clarissa's writing, though that's impossible, of course. Mrs. Bantry gave a little cry and snatched the letter. The envelope was thick and expensive. The handwriting, though shaky, was unmistakably elegant. She tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph, a small modern print of the very portrait that had been destroyed. Across the face, in bold red ink, were scrawled the words, "This is only the beginning." Mrs. Bantry dropped the letter as though it burned her. Miss Marple picked it up calmly and studied the postmark. London W1, yesterday afternoon. Colonel Bantry began to bluster. Some lunatic. I'll ring Craddock at once. While he telephoned, Miss Marple examined the photograph more closely. It had been taken with a small modern camera, probably a Kodak, from the original print while it still hung in the marquee. Someone had stood in front of the portrait, snapped it quickly, and then, later, slashed the original. She turned to Mrs. Bantry. Tell me, Dolly, when exactly was the photograph put on its easel? Yesterday morning. I arranged everything myself. Gladys helped me carry the frame from the house. And was anyone else in the marquee while you were arranging? Mrs. Bantry frowned. Only Mrs. Dane Calthrop for a moment. She brought some flowers, and young Leonard Clement came in to ask about the judging times. Oh, and Dr. Haydock looked in to say hello. That was all. Miss Marple nodded gently. 4 people, apart from Mrs. Bantry herself, who had seen the portrait before the show opened, and one of them, perhaps, had returned later with a knife. By tea-time, the whole village was buzzing again. The anonymous letter had been delivered to the police, wrapped in cotton wool and indignation. Inspector Craddock arrived at Gossington Hall looking grim. We shall need a list of everyone who entered that tent yesterday, he told the colonel. And I should like to speak to your maid, Gladys. She seems to have been one of the last people near the photograph. Gladys, summoned from the kitchen, stood twisting her apron, eyes red with crying. I never touched no knife, sir. Honest, I never. I only helped Madam carry the frame, and then I went straight back to the house. Miss Marple, who had lingered quietly in the drawing-room, watched the girl with interest. Gladys was frightened, very frightened. But was it guilt or something else? When Craddock had gone, taking the letter and photograph with him, Mrs. Bantry collapsed into a chair. First the slashing, now threats. What can it mean, Jane? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. It means, my dear, that someone believes Clarissa Bantry still has the power to hurt them, even from the grave, and they are very much afraid that an old secret is about to come out. She rose to go, pausing at the French windows to look out at the terrace where, 40 years earlier, the original photograph had been taken. Secrets, she murmured, almost to herself, have a way of lying quiet for years, and then, quite suddenly, they begin to stir. Outside, the September sunlight lay golden on the old stone steps and somewhere in the distance the church clock struck 4. In the village, people hurried home a little earlier than usual, locking doors that were normally left on the latch. And in more than one house, old memories, long buried and half forgotten, began to surface like leaves rising to the top of a pond when something moves beneath the water. The next day broke grey and fretful, with a wind that rattled the windows and sent the last roses tumbling from their stems. Miss Marple sat at her little breakfast table, buttering toast with the precision of a watchmaker, while her maid Cherry brought in the post. "Morning paper says nothing yet, miss," Cherry offered. "But the village is fair humming. They're saying the colonel's had another letter." Miss Marple's knife paused mid-air. "Another letter?" "So Mrs. Archer told me when I went for the milk. Same red writing, she says, only this time it came to the vicarage." Miss Marple folded her napkin and rose at once. 10 minutes later, she was walking briskly down the lane to the vicarage, her umbrella hooked over one arm like a soldier's rifle. The vicar, the Reverend Leonard Clement, opened the door himself. He looked older than his 60 years this morning. The skin beneath his eyes was thin and violet. "Miss Marple, how good of you to come. My wife is quite prostrated. Come in, come in." Mrs. Dane Calthrop was lying on the sofa with a rug over her knees and a hot water bottle clutched to her chest, though the room was warm. "It was addressed to me," she said in her abrupt, honest way. "Not to my husband. That is what I find so distressing." She held out a single sheet of the same thick cream paper. Miss Marple took it carefully by one corner. The message was shorter this time, the red ink thicker, almost wet-looking. "Ask Clarissa why she never married." Mrs. Dane Calthrop watched her anxiously. "I knew Clarissa slightly, years ago, before I married Leonard. She was kind to me once when I was a plain, awkward girl. I cannot bear to think ill of the dead." The vicar cleared his throat. "My nephew is here, Miss Marple. Young Leonard. He arrived last night from town. He saw the note and became most upset." Young Leonard Clement was standing by the window, hands thrust deep in the pockets of a well-cut tweed jacket. He was 32, dark, and rather too handsome in the manner that makes middle-aged ladies sigh and young ones blush. This morning he looked as though he had not slept. "I don't understand it," he burst out. "Aunt Clarissa died before I was born. Why drag her name through this filth?" Miss Marple regarded him mildly. "Because, Mr. Clement, someone believes she still has the power to injure them, and the simplest way to discredit a ghost is to blacken its reputation first." Young Leonard turned away sharply, but not before Miss Marple noticed the pulse beating hard in his temple. She stayed another 20 minutes, drinking weak tea and listening. Mrs. Dane Calthrop, once recovered from the first shock, was perfectly ready to talk. "Clarissa was engaged, in 1914, to a captain. Now what was his name? Trevelyan. Roger Trevelyan. He was killed at Ypres in 1916. After that, she never looked at another man. At least, that was the story." "Stories," said Miss Marple gently, "are often tidied up afterwards." When she left the vicarage, she did not go straight home. Instead, she turned down the side lane that led to Dr. Haydock's red brick surgery. The doctor was in his garden, burning leaves. The sharp, sweet smell drifted across the path. "Morning, Miss Marple. Come to tell me I'm working too hard?" "I have come," she replied, "to ask you about the Spanish influenza epidemic of 1921. Haydock's face changed. He poked at the fire with unnecessary violence. "That was a bad business. We lost 37 in this parish alone. Why do you ask now?" "Because I am wondering whether Clarissa Bantry was one of the 37. Haydock stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Officially, yes. I signed the certificate myself." "And unofficially?" The doctor glanced round as though the laurel hedge might have ears. "She was with child," he said at last. 6 months gone. The family wanted it hushed up. The influenza story was convenient. She died in a nursing home in London. I was told the child did not survive." Miss Marple received this revelation without the smallest change of expression. And the father? Haydock shrugged. No one ever knew for certain. Clarissa refused to say. There was talk of a married man, someone from outside the village. The Bantrys closed ranks like the Rock of Gibraltar. Miss Marple thanked him gravely and went on her way. She was passing the lych gate of the church when she encountered Mrs. Lestrange. The woman was standing quite still, staring at the war memorial as though she saw names there that no one else could read. She was tall, perhaps 45, with the kind of bone structure that makes other women speak of good looks wasted. Her black coat was expensive, but it had seen better days. The fur at the collar was rubbed. "Good morning, Miss Marple, isn't it?" Her voice was low, almost husky. "It is indeed," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "You are Mrs. Lestrange. I hope you are settling comfortably into Laburnum Cottage." Mrs. Lestrange gave a faint, wintry smile. "One settles where one must." There was a pause. Then, quite suddenly, she said, "I knew Clarissa Bantry once, a long time ago." Miss Marple waited. When nothing more came, she asked gently, "Were you very fond of her?" The woman's face twisted. "I was her maid," she said, "for 8 months in 1920. Then I was sent away without a character. She saw to that." She turned on her heel and walked quickly toward the village, leaving Miss Marple looking after her with quiet, unwavering attention. That afternoon, Inspector Craddock called at the cottage in the High Street. He accepted a cup of tea and refused a slice of cherries seed cake with the air of a man who has too much on his mind. "We've traced the paper," he said without preamble. "It's handmade, expensive, sold only by one stationer in Jermyn Street. The envelopes too. Someone with money or access to it. And the red ink. Common enough. But the handwriting interests me. The capitals, especially. Very distinctive slant. I've sent samples to the yard." Miss Marple poured him another cup. "Have you considered, Inspector, that the letters may be intended not to frighten, but to warn?" Craddock frowned. "Warn whom?" "Someone who is in danger," said Miss Marple softly, "from the consequences of an old lie." Outside, the wind rose, rattling the windows like impatient fingers, and in the quiet houses of St. Mary Mead, more than one person lay awake that night, listening to the darkness and wondering whose turn it would be next to receive a letter written in angry red. The following morning brought the first real frost. The village roofs glittered like sugar, and the breath of early milk carts hung white in the air. By 9 o'clock, Inspector Craddock's men were going from door to door with a photograph of the slashed portrait and a list of questions no one wished to answer honestly. At Gossington Hall, Colonel Bantry had taken refuge in his gun room and refused to come out. Mrs. Bantry, pale but determined, received the inspector in the morning room. "I've been thinking all night," she announced. "There is only one person who could possibly hate Clarissa enough for this. Mrs. Lestrange. She was Clarissa's maid, you know. Dismissed without a reference. People do remember these things." Craddock made a note. "We shall certainly speak to Mrs. Lestrange again, but the letters are being posted in London, Mrs. Bantry. That suggests someone who travels." Mrs. Bantry waved this objection away. Servants always know people in London. Miss Marple, who had been invited to remain after breakfast, in case Dolly had another attack of nerves, listened quietly from the corner. She noticed that Mrs. Bantry's hands trembled whenever Clarissa's name was spoken, and that the Colonel's Labrador had been shut in the gun-room with its master, an almost unprecedented occurrence. At 11 o'clock, young Leonard Clement arrived, uninvited and furious. "I have just come from the police station," he said without preamble. "They searched my rooms at the vicarage. My uncle is distressed beyond words. This has to stop." Craddock regarded him steadily. "Routine, Mr. Clement. You were one of the last people known to have been alone in the photographic tent. And you have admitted to a family connection with Miss Clarissa Bantry." Leonard's face darkened. "Connection? She was my mother's cousin. That is all." Mrs. Bantry gave a little gasp. "Leonard, dear boy, no one is accusing you." "Aren't they?" He laughed bitterly. "Then why ask about the scar on my left wrist? Why ask whether I ever visited a certain nursing home in Welbeck Street in 1921? His voice cracked. "I was not born until 1923. He turned and strode out, slamming the door so hard that a Waterford decanter trembled on the sideboard. There was a difficult silence. Then Craddock said quietly, "He does have a very distinctive scar, Miss Marple. Old but deep. Runs from the base of the thumb almost to the elbow." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Birthmarks and scars are sometimes inherited, Inspector, as well as fortunes." Mrs. Bantry stared at her. "Jane, what on earth do you mean?" But Miss Marple only smiled and asked whether there might be another cup of coffee. By noon, the village had its obvious villain. Leonard Clement, handsome, quick-tempered, and, whispered Mrs. Price Ridley behind her hand at the fishmonger's, quite possibly illegitimate, was the perfect suspect. He had quarrelled publicly with his uncle only last month about money. He had been in the marquee. He had a scar. He had stormed out of Gossington Hall in full view of half the garden staff. Inspector Craddock, though too experienced to arrest on village gossip, nevertheless requested that young Mr. Clement remain within reach of the police station for further inquiries. A plainclothes man took up residence at the Blue Boar, drinking ginger beer and watching the vicarage gate. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Lestrange. Laburnum Cottage was small and impeccably neat, yet there was something bleak about it, as though its occupant had never intended to stay. Mrs. Lestrange received her visitor in the little sitting room. A coal fire burned brightly, but the woman herself seemed cold. "I suppose you have come to accuse me," she said directly. "I've come," Miss Marple replied, settling herself in the single comfortable chair, "to ask why you returned to St. Mary Mead after 25 years. Mrs. Lestrange's lips twisted. "Because I was tired of pretending to be someone I am not, and because I wanted to see whether any of them still remembered." "Remembered what, precisely?" For a long moment, the woman said nothing. Then she opened a drawer in the small walnut bureau and took out a silver-framed photograph. It was a picture of a baby, a boy, perhaps 3 months old, wrapped in a christening robe of fine lace. Miss Marple studied it carefully. The child had a birthmark, dark and unmistakable, on the left wrist. "My son," Mrs. Lestrange said. Her voice was flat, almost without expression. "Taken from me the day he was born. The Bantrys paid for everything. The nursing home, the adoption papers, the silence. Clarissa signed them herself. She was very good at signing things that ruined other people's lives." Miss Marple handed the photograph back. "And young Mr. Clement?" she asked gently. Mrs. Lestrange laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Look at him, Miss Marple. Look at the shape of the head, the set of the ears. Then look at that scar he is so careful to hide under his cuff. He was born with the cord round his arm. The midwife told me it would mark him for life." She rose and went to the window, staring out at the bare garden. "I came back to watch him live the life that should have been my son's. That was all I wanted at first. Just to watch. Then I saw the photograph at the flower show and something snapped." Miss Marple's voice was very soft. "You slashed the portrait?" "No." Mrs. Lestrange turned. There were tears on her cheeks now, bright and sudden. "I wanted to. God help me. I stood in front of it with the paper knife from my bag trembling in my hand. But I could not do it. Someone else got there first." Miss Marple believed her. There is a quality and true emotion that no acting can counterfeit, and Mrs. Lestrange's bitterness had the ring of long nursing rather than fresh guilt. When Miss Marple left the cottage, the light was fading. She walked slowly homeward, her mind busy with patterns. A baby taken, a mother silenced, a boy growing up in ignorance of his own history, And somewhere in the village a person ruthless enough to slash a smiling face and then to threaten exposure in letters written in angry red. At her gate, she paused, looking towards the church tower, black against the winter sky. So many people with reason to hate Clarissa Bantry, she murmured, yet only one with reason to protect her secret at any cost. Behind her, in the dusk, footsteps approached, quick, impatient footsteps. She turned to see young Leonard Clement, coat collar turned up, eyes wild. "Miss Marple," he said hoarsely, "they are saying I did it. They are saying I am—" He could not finish. Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "My dear boy," she said, "come inside and have a cup of tea. And then perhaps you had better tell me exactly why you went to Welbeck Street when you were 7 years old, and what the woman there gave you that you have kept ever since." Leonard stared at her, white to the lips. For a moment, it seemed he might bolt into the darkness. Then his shoulders sagged, and he followed her meekly up the path, like a child caught out in some terrible mischief. The frost deepened. Somewhere in the village a door slammed, and a dog began to bark. And in Miss Marple's neat little sitting room, the fire burned bright, waiting to throw its steady light on secrets that had lain in shadow for almost 30 years. Leonard Clement sat on the very edge of Miss Marple's chintz-covered chair, as though the springs might burn him. Cherry had been sent to bed with a whispered instruction and a slice of cake. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock and the soft collapse of coal in the grate. Miss Marple poured tea with the same unhurried grace she brought to everything, 2 cups, weak for herself, strong and very sweet for her visitor. Shock, she had long ago decided, required sugar. Leonard wrapped both hands round the cup as though they were cold. "I was 7, he began at last, voice low. "My mother, my adoptive mother, took me to London for the day. She said it was to choose a birthday train at Hamleys, but we never went near the shop. We took a taxi to Welbeck Street and stopped outside a tall grey house with a shining brass plate. She told me to wait on the steps. 5 minutes, she said." He drank the tea in one scalding gulp. A woman came out, tall, dark, dressed in black. She looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then she knelt, right there on the pavement, and pushed back the sleeve of my coat. She saw the birthmark, everyone always noticed it, and she began to cry without making any sound at all. She pressed something into my hand, closed my fingers over it, and kissed my wrist exactly where the mark is. Then she stood up and walked back into the house. The door shut. My mother came hurrying out a moment later and dragged me away. She was furious. She said if I ever told anyone we had been there, she would send me to boarding school in Scotland. Miss Marple waited. Leonard opened his clenched fist. On his palm lay a tiny gold locket, no larger than a 6pence, delicately engraved with a forget-me-not. He pressed the spring. Inside was a curl of dark baby hair, and, on the opposite side, a miniature photograph. Clarissa Bantry, at 20, smiling the same serene smile that had been slashed to ribbons 3 days earlier. "I've carried it ever since," he said. "I never understood why until I saw the big portrait at the flower show. The likeness was unmistakable. That was when I began to be afraid." Miss Marple took the locket gently, angling it toward the lamp. The hinge was worn smooth. It had been opened countless times. "And the scar?" she asked. "Appendicitis when I was 12. The birthmark made the surgeons nervous. They cut wider than necessary. I used to hate it. Now—" His voice cracked again. Miss Marple closed the locket and returned it. "Your real mother believes you to be Mrs. Lestrange's son," she said quietly. "Mrs. Lestrange believes you to be hers, yet neither of them slashed the photograph and neither wrote the letters. That leaves us with someone who wishes the secret to remain buried at all costs. Someone who benefits from your continuing ignorance." Leonard stared at her. "Who? That, my dear, is what we must discover before the next letter arrives. And I rather think it will arrive tomorrow." She She rose and went to the little bureau, taking out a sheet of her own pale blue writing paper. "Will you do something for me? Write these words exactly as I dictate. Use your left hand. It will disguise the slope." He obeyed, puzzled. She watched the pen move slowly across the page. "The photograph that lied will lie no more." When he had finished, she folded the sheet, placed it in an envelope, and addressed it to herself. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "you will post this from the box outside the church at 8:30. Then you will walk straight to the police station and give yourself up for questioning. Tell Inspector Craddock everything you have told me. Do not omit the locket." Leonard went white. "They'll arrest me." "They will not," Miss Marple replied serenely, "because by the time you reach the station, the true writer of the red letters will already have betrayed themselves." She would explain no further. At the door, she laid a small, capable hand on his sleeve. "Courage, Mr. Clement. The truth is a painful thing, but it is the only thing that ever sets anyone free." After he had gone, she sat for a long time by the dying fire, the forged letter in her lap, turning the tiny gold locket over and over between her fingers. She was thinking of a winter morning 29 years earlier, a desperate girl in a London nursing home, a forged death certificate, a newborn baby spirited away before he had even opened his eyes, and a woman somewhere signing papers with a hand that did not tremble because Clarissa Bantry had never trembled in her life. Outside, the frost hardened on the window panes like lace, and the village slept uneasily beneath a thin moon. At 20 minutes past midnight, the front door bell of the vicarage rang sharply once, then again. Urgent. Frightened. The Reverend Leonard Clement stumbled downstairs in his dressing gown to find a plain envelope lying on the mat. The writing on it was in the same violent red. He opened it with shaking fingers. Inside was a single photograph. The baby picture Mrs. Lestrange had shown Miss Marple that afternoon. And across the infant's face someone had drawn, with savage precision, 3 deep slashes in crimson ink. The vicar stood staring at it until his wife found him there at dawn, grey-faced and speechless, the mutilated photograph still clutched in his hand. And in her cottage at the end of the lane, Miss Marple laid the forged letter on her bedside table, set her alarm clock for 7, and slept as peacefully as a child, because she now knew exactly whose fear had turned to murderous rage when an old photograph smiled again after 30 years of careful silence. The morning was sharp and bright, the frost still thick on the grass, when young Leonard Clement walked to the red pillar box outside the church. His breath smoked in the air. His heart beat so loudly he was sure the postman could hear it. At exactly 8:30, he dropped Miss Marple's forged envelope through the slot and turned towards the police station, shoulders squared like a man going to his execution. At 25 minutes to 9, Inspector Craddock received an urgent telephone call from the vicarage. The Reverend Leonard Clement's voice shook so violently that half the words were lost, but the message was clear. Another photograph had been mutilated, this time the baby picture, and the vicar was quite beside himself. Craddock arrived to find the household in chaos. Mrs. Dane Calthrop, usually the calmest woman in the parish, was weeping into her apron. The vicar sat at his desk staring at the slashed photograph as though it were a live scorpion. "I found it on the mat at midnight," he kept repeating. "No footsteps, no sound. Whoever put it there must have been watching the house." Craddock examined the envelope. Same cream paper, same London postmark. But this one had been posted yesterday afternoon, hours before the baby photograph had even been shown to Miss Marple. Someone else possessed an identical print. At 9 o'clock precisely, Miss Marple's maid Cherry answered a ring at the door and returned with a small brown paper parcel addressed in red ink to Miss J. Marple, personal. Cherry, who had strict instructions, carried it straight to the kitchen table without touching the string. Miss Marple, already dressed in her Sunday coat and best lavender gloves, opened it carefully with a silver fruit knife. Inside was a single object, the original slashed portrait from the flower show. Glass removed, the 3 savage cuts across Clarissa's face now deepened and widened until the paper itself was almost severed. Tucked into the broken frame was a note. "You have been warned. Stop meddling, or the next face will be flesh." Miss Marple read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in her handbag beside the forged envelope she had received from Leonard 5 minutes earlier. "Thank you, Cherry," she said calmly. "I shall be gone most of the day. If anyone calls, tell them I've gone to London." She walked to the police station where Leonard Clement was already being questioned in a cloud of cigarette smoke and suspicion. Inspector Craddock looked up in relief when she appeared. "Miss Marple, thank heaven. Young Mr. Clement has told us a remarkable story, which happens to be true in every particular," she finished for him. "And I've just received the original portrait together with a threat written on the same paper as all the others. Whoever is doing this has made 2 mistakes this morning." She laid the brown paper parcel on the desk. "First, they delivered the portrait by hand instead of trusting the post. Second, they used string." Craddock looked blank. "String?" Miss Marple lifted the parcel. A length of common household twine was knotted tightly round it in a series of intricate hitches. "Boy Scouts," she said simply. "Or rather, a man who was once a Boy Scout and has never quite lost the habit. Notice the reef knots and the final clove hitch. Very distinctive. Colonel Bantry taught generations of village boys to tie knots exactly like these during the war. He was rather proud of it." Craddock stared at the string as though it had suddenly turned into a snake. "You are saying Colonel Bantry?" "I'm saying," Miss Marple corrected gently, "that someone who watched the Colonel teach those knots 40 years ago has never forgotten them. Someone who spent a great deal of time at Gossington Hall as a child." She turned to Leonard. "Tell the inspector about the summer of 1918 when you believe you were conceived. Tell him who was stationed at the hall when it was a convalescent home for officers." Leonard passed a hand across his eyes. "Captain Roger Trevelyan," he said slowly. "Clarissa's fiancé. He was wounded at Passchendaele and sent home for 6 months. Everyone said he and Clarissa would be married as soon as he recovered. Then he was killed at Ypres the following year. Everyone," Miss Marple repeated softly, "was told he was killed. Death is very easy to arrange when there is money and influence. A man who wishes to disappear may do so quite convincingly if the right people are willing to help." Craddock began to see daylight. "You mean Trevelyan did not die?" "I mean," said Miss Marple, "that a certain gentleman who now lives quietly in Bournemouth under the name of Mr. Carstairs receives a quarterly check from the Bantry family solicitors. I made a telephone call from the post office yesterday afternoon. The firm was most obliging once I mentioned Clarissa's name." She opened her handbag and took out the tiny gold locket Leonard had given her. "Clarissa kept this. She intended one day to give her son his true history, but she died, or was said to have died, before she could do so. Someone discovered the locket among her effects and has lived in terror ever since that it would resurface." Craddock was already reaching for his hat. "Colonel Bantry knew?" "Colonel Bantry," said Miss Marple with a trace of sadness, "has spent 30 years trying to forget he ever had a sister who disgraced the family name. He arranged everything. The false death certificate, the adoption, the payments to Captain Trevelyan to stay away forever. When the portrait appeared at the flower show, he saw his carefully buried past smiling at him again. The letters were intended to discredit Clarissa before the truth could come out. The slashing was panic. The threat to me this morning was desperation." She looked at Leonard with great compassion. "The Colonel is your uncle, my dear, and he has spent your entire life being terrified of you. At Gossington Hall, they found Colonel Bantry in the gun room, a revolver on the desk in front of him and an open bottle of whiskey at his elbow. He looked up when Craddock entered, and for the first time in his life, the old soldier had no bluster left. 'I couldn't let it all come out,' he said dully. 'Not after everything we did to keep it quiet. The regiment, my wife, The boy himself. Better he go on thinking himself a bastard than know the truth. He pushed the revolver away. I never meant anyone to be hurt, only frightened. The letters were supposed to make people think it was that Lestrange woman. When young Leonard started asking questions, I lost my head. Mrs. Bantry, standing white-faced in the doorway, began to cry without sound. Miss Marple stepped forward and laid the broken portrait on the desk between them. "Clarissa's face has been hurt quite enough, Colonel," she said quietly. "It is time to let it rest." Outside, the frost was already melting under a pale, wintry sun. The village would talk for months, perhaps years, but some secrets, once dragged into the light, lose their power to wound. Leonard Clement walked slowly down the drive of Gossington Hall, the little gold locket warm in his pocket, and for the first time in his life he felt the full weight and the strange freedom of knowing exactly who he was. The arrest of Colonel Bantry fell upon St. Mary Mead like a thunderclap, followed by a long, uneasy silence. People who had known him all their lives, bowled with him at cricket, drunk his port after hunt dinners, watched him hand out prizes on Empire Day, could not reconcile the florid, barking old soldier with the man who had slashed a photograph and written threats in red ink. By evening, the story had twisted itself into a dozen different shapes. Some said he had gone mad with guilt, others that he had been protecting the regiment's honor. A few, more romantically inclined, insisted he had loved his sister too much to let the world call her a wanton woman. The truth, as usual, was simpler and uglier. He had loved the idea of the family more than any person in it. Inspector Craddock removed the colonel quietly, almost gently, in the police car. Mrs. Bantry stood on the steps in her camel hair coat, clutching the broken frame of the portrait as though it were all that remained of her old life. She did not wave goodbye. At the vicarage, young Leonard Clement sat with his uncle and Mrs. Dane Calthrop until the small hours, talking in low voices about inheritance, forgiveness, and the difference between being born in shame and living in it. When dawn came, pale and watery, Leonard walked to Laburnum Cottage and knocked on Mrs. Lestrange's door. She opened it slowly, as though she had been expecting someone else entirely. "I am not your son," he said without greeting, "but I think I am the nearest thing to one you will ever have." Mrs. Lestrange looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "The kettle is on." That same afternoon, Miss Marple received 2 visitors in quick succession. The first was Dr. Haydock, smelling of tobacco and winter air. "I signed a false certificate," he said bluntly, standing on her hearthrug as though on trial. "I was 28, ambitious, and the Bantrys were the most important family in the county. I've lived with it ever since." Miss Marple offered him a slice of Cherry's Dundee cake. He refused. "I shan't be struck off," he went on. "Craddock is being decent about it. But I shall resign at Christmas. Time to let a younger man take over who doesn't carry quite so much baggage." He hesitated at the door. "You knew all along, didn't you?" "I suspected," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Suspicion is not proof, and some burdens are not ours to lift from other people's shoulders." When he had gone, Mrs. Bantry arrived, muffled in furs and veiled like a mourner. "I am leaving Gossington," she announced. "The house will be sold. Arthur will be away for some time. The solicitors say 2 years, perhaps less with good behavior. I shall go to Eastbourne. My sister has a flat there." She sat down suddenly, as though her legs had given way. "Tell me honestly, Jane, did I know? In my heart, did I know what he had done to that poor girl?" Miss Marple considered this with her usual dispassionate kindness. "You knew your husband was capable of ruthless decisions in defense of what he called honor. Whether you let yourself examine the cost is another matter. We none of us look too closely at things that might force us to act against those we love." Mrs. Bantry began to cry then, quietly and without drama. Miss Marple let her cry. 2 days later, the village attended the magistrate's court in Much Benham. Colonel Bantry, in a dark suit that no longer fitted properly, pleaded guilty to malicious damage, sending threatening letters and attempting to pervert the course of justice. The chairman, an old friend who could scarcely bring himself to look at the prisoner, committed him for trial at the next assizes. Bail was granted, but no one expected him to return to Gossington Hall. On the train home, Miss Marple found herself sharing a first-class compartment with Mrs. Lestrange and Leonard Clement. They were traveling together to London, to the offices of the Bantry family solicitors, to begin the long, delicate business of untangling birth certificates, adoption papers, and the small trust Clarissa had set up in 1921 for my son, should he ever need it. Mrs. Lestrange looked almost young in the pale November light. "I've waited 29 years, she said quietly. "Another few months will not matter." Leonard stared out at the flying hedges. "I keep thinking of her," he said. "Clarissa, wondering what she would have wanted." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "She wanted you to have a choice," she replied. "That is why she kept the locket. Not to bind you, but to free you when the time came." At Paddington they parted. Leonard raised his hat. Mrs. Lestrange managed a small, tremulous smile. Miss Marple watched them disappear into the crowd and felt the familiar, bittersweet ache that always came when a story ended and real life, messy, imperfect, and stubbornly hopeful, began. Back in St. Mary Mead, the first Christmas cards were already in the post office window. The scandal would linger, of course. Villages have long memories, but it would settle, like silt at the bottom of a pond, and the water above would grow clear again. One evening in early December, Miss Marple sat by her fire, addressing her own cards. She paused at one addressed to a nursing home in Bournemouth. "Dear Captain Trevelyan, or Mr. Carstairs if you prefer, I hope this finds you as well as the season allows. A wrong has been righted, though not without cost. Your son, yes, he knows now, sends his respectful good wishes and asks whether you would care to meet him one day when you feel strong enough. There is no hurry. Some meetings are better left until the heart has had time to prepare itself. Yours very sincerely, Jane Marple." She sealed the envelope, laid down her pen, and looked into the flames. "Human nature," she murmured to the quiet room, "is a very curious thing. It can wound so deeply, and yet, given time and a little courage, it can heal almost anything." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall on St. Mary Mead, soft and silent, covering the old scars with a clean, forgiving white. Snow lay thick on the village by the third week of December, muffling footsteps and softening even the sharpest gossip. Colonel Bantry had been moved to a quiet open prison in Devon. Mrs. Bantry's furniture vans rumbled away from Gossington Hall one iron-cold morning and did not return. The great house stood, shuttered, its windows blind, waiting for strangers to give it a new name and a new history. Yet life, as Miss Marple often observed, has a way of continuing in spite of everything. Leonard Clement, newly acknowledged as Clarissa Bantry's son and heir to whatever remained of the family money after legal fees, spent Christmas at Laburnum Cottage with Mrs. Lestrange. They took their meals together in the little back kitchen, speaking carefully at first, then with the wondering ease of people discovering they have always belonged to one another. On Christmas afternoon, they walked to the churchyard and stood for a long time before the plain stone that read simply, "Clarissa Mary Bantry. 1895, 1921, at rest, Leonard laid a spray of winter jasmine on the grave. Mrs. Lestrange, who had once been plain Ellen Hawke's lady's maid, touched the letters of the name with a gloved finger, as though tracing the shape of a life she had never been allowed to share. "She would be glad," she said at last. "Glad you know who you are." Leonard did not answer at once. Snowflakes caught in his lashes. "I wish I could have told her I forgive her," he said, "for giving me away, for everything." Mrs. Lestrange slipped her arm through his. She didn't give you away, my dear. She tried to give you the world. It was the world that refused. They walked home slowly, two dark figures against the white, and no one who saw them pass thought to whisper or stare any longer. At the vicarage, the Reverend Leonard Clement and his wife prepared for the midnight service as they had done for 30 years, though this year the sermon was shorter and the prayers for the departed rather longer. When the bells rang out across the snow, half the village turned out in boots and mufflers, drawn by habit and by the comfortable knowledge that some things, at least, remained unchanged. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew near the stove, a crocheted shawl about her shoulders, her mild blue eyes resting now on Leonard and Mrs. Lestrange in the Bantry pew, empty these 40 years, now on Dr. Haydock, who had come for the last time before his resignation, now on young Gladys, the maid who had been given a new post in Torquay, and a generous reference by a repentant Mrs. Bantry. After the service, the congregation lingered in the porch, wishing one another a Merry Christmas in voices hushed by snowfall and candlelight. Miss Marple found herself beside Inspector Craddock, who had driven over from Much Benham especially. "A quiet ending," he said, offering her his arm down the icy path. "I like those best." "There are no quiet endings," Miss Marple replied, taking the arm with a small, grateful nod. "Only new chapters. But this one, I think, will be gentler than the last." They walked together as far as her gate. "Will you come in for a glass of my homemade cowslip wine?" she asked. "Another time, perhaps. I'm due back at the station." He hesitated. "There is one thing I never understood. How did you know the Colonel would send the portrait to you that morning? You had the parcel ready for me before it even arrived." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled in the lamplight. "Because, my dear Inspector, he had run out of threats. A man who begins by slashing a face in a photograph and ends by threatening an old lady with the same knife is a man who has nothing left but fright. Fright makes people return to the scene of their crime. The portrait was his crime. He needed to be rid of it, and he needed to believe he had frightened me into silence. Posting it would have taken too long. Driving through the night was the action of a desperate man. I merely provided him with the opportunity to betray himself." Craddock shook his head in admiration. "You set a trap without ever leaving your chair." "An old woman's weapon," said Miss Marple demurely, "is knowing exactly how far panic will carry a guilty man." She bade him good night and let herself into the warm, lamplit cottage where Cherry had left a tray with cocoa and a hot water bottle. Before she went upstairs, she paused in the sitting room and took from a drawer the tiny gold locket Leonard had returned to her for safekeeping until he should decide what to do with it. She opened it, studied the curl of baby hair and the miniature of the smiling girl, and then, very gently, closed it again. "Poor Clarissa," she murmured. "You tried so hard to do right, and everyone punished you for it. But your son will be happy now. That, at least, you have achieved." She placed the locket in a small velvet box and locked it away in the bureau. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and deliberate, covering the roofs of St. Mary Mead with the same impartial kindness it had shown for centuries. Somewhere, a clock struck one. Miss Marple turned out the lamps and went quietly up to bed. In the morning, the village would wake to a white Christmas, to children shouting and church bells, and the smell of roasting goose drifting from cottage chimneys. The scandal would be spoken of less and less. New babies would be born, old folk would die, and the great wheel would turn again. And in her neat little room under the eaves, Miss Marple slept peacefully, dreaming not of murders or threats or slashed photographs, but of a young woman on a sunlit terrace in 1912 laughing as she arranged her brothers beside her, never guessing how many lives that single moment of happiness would one day touch. Some photographs, after all, do not lie. They simply wait. The thaw came early that year. By the first week of February, the snow had melted into muddy runnels along the lanes, and the first crocuses pushed brave purple heads through the wet earth of Miss Marple's front garden. On a morning bright with birdsong, she received a visitor she had not expected to see again. Captain Roger Trevelyan, though he still signed himself Carstairs, on the hotel register, stood on her doorstep looking frail but determined. He had lost weight. The Bournemouth sea air had not agreed with him, yet his eyes, the same clear grey that had once made Clarissa Bantry's heart turn over, were steady. "I had to come," he said simply, "to thank you, and to ask whether you think he will ever forgive me." Miss Marple led him into the sitting room where the fire was newly laid. Cherry brought coffee and withdrew with unusual tact. "Leonard has spent 29 years believing his father died a hero," the old man went on, turning the cup in hands that trembled only slightly. "Now he knows I ran away, that I took the money and let them bury an empty coffin with Clarissa's name on it. I do not know how a son forgives that." Miss Marple regarded him with the same gentle detachment she might have shown a difficult stitch in her knitting. "Leonard has spent the last 3 months learning that the people who loved him most were also the ones who hurt him most. He is discovering that love and cowardice can live in the same heart. It is a hard lesson, but not a fatal one." Trevelyan's mouth twisted. "I was 27, shell-shocked, half a lung gone, and Clarissa told me the child was not mine. She said it would be better for everyone if I disappeared. The Bantrys offered money, enough to live quietly, enough never to have to explain. I took it. God help me. I took it and spent 30 years telling myself I had no choice." He looked up suddenly. "Was the child mine, Miss Marple? All these years I have wondered." Miss Marple's reply was soft but merciless. "Yes. Clarissa lied to make the parting cleaner. She thought a dead hero was a kinder legacy than a living coward. She was very young." Trevelyan bent his head. For a long time, the only sound was the ticking of the clock and the soft collapse of coal. "I should like to see him," he said at last. "Just once. From a distance, if that is all he can bear." Miss Marple considered this with her usual tranquil deliberation. "I will ask him," she said, "but you must prepare yourself for any answer, including silence." She did ask 2 days later, when Leonard and Mrs. Lestrange, who now answered comfortably to the name Ellen Clement, came to tea. Leonard listened without interrupting while Miss Marple repeated the conversation almost word for word. When she had finished, he sat very still, staring at the pattern on the carpet. "I thought I would feel rage," he said at last. "But I only feel tired, as though I have been angry for someone else's entire life." He looked at Ellen, who reached across and took his hand. "Your father is an old man," she said quietly. "Old men carry their own punishments. Let him see you, not for his sake, for yours, so that the story can end." Leonard came alone to Bournemouth on a bitter day in March. He found Trevelyan waiting on the pier, wrapped in an overcoat 2 sizes too large, staring out at a grey sea. They walked the length of the pier and back without speaking. At the far end, Trevelyan stopped and took from his pocket a small leather case. "I kept this," he said. His voice was almost lost in the wind. "All these years." Inside was a photograph. Clarissa at 19, wind-blown and laughing, the same photograph that had hung in the flower show, only smaller, carried next to a soldier's heart through mud and shell fire. "I never stopped loving her," Trevelyan said. "I only stopped being brave enough to deserve her." Leonard took the photograph. For a long moment he studied the smiling girl who had been his mother. "She looks happy," he said. "She was," Trevelyan answered, "until she tried to do the right thing by everyone and ended by ruining us all." Leonard slipped the photograph into his own pocket. "Come and have lunch," he said abruptly. "There's a hotel along the front that does reasonable fish. My treat." They walked back along the pier side by side, 2 dark figures against the restless sea, neither quite certain whether they were father and son or merely 2 men who had once, separately, loved the same woman. It was enough. That evening, Leonard telephoned Miss Marple from the station. "I didn't call him father," he reported. a note of wonder in his voice. "But I think I might one day, when it stops hurting quite so much." Miss Marple smiled into the receiver. "That is how healing begins, my dear. One small, ordinary afternoon at a time." She set the telephone down gently and returned to her chair by the fire. Outside, the first daffodils were opening along the lane, reckless and golden. In the quiet room, she allowed herself a small, satisfied sigh. Another pattern completed, another tangle of human hearts smoothed into something that would, with care, hold. And somewhere, very faintly, as though from a great distance, she thought she heard Clarissa Bantry laughing on a sunlit terrace in 1912, young and fearless and utterly, entirely forgiven. Spring arrived all at once, the way it does in English villages. One morning the hedges were bare, the next they were loud with green. The sailboard came down from Gossington Hall. Rumour said a film producer from London had bought it for weekend parties. No one in St. Mary Mead was quite sure whether to be shocked or flattered. Colonel Bantry's trial came and went in a single grey day at the Spring Assizes. He stood very straight in the dock, medals gleaming on a borrowed suit, and pleaded guilty to everything. The judge, who had known him since Sandhurst, spoke sadly of a fine record tarnished at the last. 2 years, suspended after 18 months. The colonel bowed, thanked his lordship, and was led away without looking at the public gallery where his wife sat alone, small and veiled. Mrs. Bantry left for Eastbourne the same week. She sent Miss Marple a postcard of the pier and a note that said only, "The sea is kind. I am learning to be kinder to myself." Dolly. Life, as Miss Marple had predicted, resumed its gentle rhythm. Leonard Clement, now properly Leonard Bantry on the new birth certificate the solicitors had somehow arranged, moved into Laburnum Cottage with Ellen. They turned the front parlour into a small office. He had taken a partnership in a London firm of architects, but insisted on working 3 days a week from the village. On fine evenings he could be seen pushing Mrs. Lestrange, Ellen in a bath chair along the lanes, both of them laughing at private jokes no one else understood. Captain Trevelyan, still Mr. Carstairs to the Bournemouth landlady, came for a fortnight in May. He and Leonard walked the downs every morning, talking of everything and nothing. On the last day, Trevelyan handed his son a sealed envelope. "My medals," he said gruffly, "and the letter I wrote to Clarissa the night before I died. Never posted. Thought you might keep them, or burn them, whichever feels right." Leonard kept them. They lie now in the velvet box beside the little gold locket and the curl of baby hair. Dr. Haydock left at midsummer. His successor was a brisk young woman from Manchester who shocked the parish by riding a bicycle in trousers. Within a month, everyone agreed she was quite sensible, really. One warm afternoon in June, Miss Marple sat in her garden pruning the roses when Leonard and Ellen came up the path carrying a large flat parcel wrapped in brown paper. "We have something for you," Ellen said, colour high in her cheeks. Leonard unwrapped it carefully. It was the original 1912 photograph, restored, reframed, the terrible slashes mended so cleverly that only the faintest shadows remained across Clarissa's smiling face. Beneath the mount, in Leonard's neat architect's hand, was written, "To Miss Jane Marple, who gave us back our mother with gratitude that will never fade, LB&EC." Miss Marple studied it for a long time without speaking. At last, she touched the glass very lightly with one finger. "She looks happy again," she said softly. "That is the best restoration of all." They hung it that same evening above her fireplace, between the watercolour of the Bay of Naples and the sampler worked by her great-aunt in 1873. It looked, as Ellen said, as though it had always belonged there. Years later, long after Miss Marple herself had gone to her own quiet rest in the churchyard beside the yew tree, Visitors to the cottage museum would pause in front of the photograph and read the inscription. Children would ask who the pretty lady was, and the guide would answer, "That was Clarissa Bantry. She caused a great deal of trouble once, simply by smiling at the wrong time. But in the end, a very wise old lady made sure her smile was returned to her." And if the light was right, the faint scars across the glass almost disappeared, and Clarissa looked out at the world exactly as she had on that golden afternoon in 1912. Serene, fearless, and entirely forgiven. In St. Mary Mead, the church clock still strikes the hours, the roses still bloom, and secrets, when they are gently and thoroughly untangled, lose their power to hurt anyone ever again. The photograph, quite simply, no longer lied.